welcome to the Cardboard Herald podcast. I am Eric, joined, as usual, by my lovely, nebulous co-host, Jack.
Nailed it. Absolutely nailed it.
The center of
what you
everything.
Been playing,
is
Eric?
Nebulous. The main thing I've been playing is a game that I am playtesting for myself. I've been working on a design the last couple weeks.
How dare you not tell me all about this over the last couple of weeks? What you playing?
Honeymoon whist trick-taking game, which is two-player trick-taking. Whoever wins the trick gets a card that's face-up on the deck, and then whoever loses the trick just gets a random card. So you are trying to lose tricks that aren't going to help you, and you try to win tricks that are going to help you. And that's what Honeymoon Whist is. And I'm trying to make it a astro mining. You are trying to place all of your space stations by the end of the game, and you get different resources based on what combination of tricks you win.
Is the theme at all inspired by Galactic Cruise plays that you've had lately?
Well, a little bit. It started way. I've had this one kicking around in my head for a while. I mentioned it at PAX Unplugged to somebody who asked me what I've been designing recently, and I've just now finally gotten it to the table. Not because I take a while to get things to the table. Like, when I have an idea of playtesting, I usually do it pretty quickly, but I just had I don't even know what this game is going to look like. Whereas, I don't even know, what the objectives are going to be. But it was actually Gazebo that got me back into thinking about this game, because I really liked the win condition in Gazebo is to actually get all of your pieces onto the board. That's how you win. There's no victory points. It doesn't matter how well you've played throughout. It is just who can be the first to get all of their gazebos onto the board. And that got me back into this is something that I've been wanting to try out. So,
are we going to see this at PAX Unplugged as a unpub game? I mean,
probably
that might be a good opportunity for you. I mean, when you think about it, you are relatively early in your game design journey, having dipped your toes into it, but you've gotten progressively more and more immersed. You've studied a lot. Mm-hmm. You have a lot of game designs that you've played around with, that you've gotten to prototype stages, and that's a big part of how you immerse yourself in this hobby. And now you're in DC. There's a vibrant design community there. There's conventions you have access to. I'd love to see it if the Cardboard Herald has a person who is in the unpub room, not just looking at games, but showing off games.
This is the game I have to offer. Well, yeah, and I mean, I think that's the hope, is that I will have something that is, easy to show, or, able to show, especially you, just because I like playing games with you, and I also like your opinions on games, for the most part. There are a couple we disagree on. But for the most part, I like your opinions on games, and so it works out pretty well for me to, have you, even just as this is what I got kicking around. What's going on with it? What can I fix here? Which that's just helpful.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I've been playing that. I've got another play of Galactic Cruise in. The solo mode is growing on me. I kind of wasn't the biggest fan of it to start. I think it's such a solid game, but I think I mentioned previously that it feels like it's losing something by being solo mode. It feels like a lot of the part of the game that I'm going to really enjoy is going to be the social interaction and the bumping players and making choices of which players to bump. But the most recent playthroughs I've had have felt very much cleaner, and I think that also is just I'm learning the game more. I'm jumping up the difficulty scale because it has a couple different difficulties you can play at. So
remind me, are you playing that on BGA or is that a physical copy?
Physical copy.
Ooh, baby, right there. Oh, it's a chonker.
It's a big
game.
I
was going to ask, how is the setup and takedown on that game?
So when I first got the game, it has a welcome packet. I'm trying to open it to show you the welcome packet. which is hard
now
to do.
Now we get to have this amazing documentation of Eric's struggle to open a box.
It comes with a welcome packet that, first of all, I don't know if this comes with everybody's, but mine came with a lanyard. It comes with, like, this letter, like, introducing you to the concept of the game. A postcard. None of these have any functional reason to be in the game. Like, none of these actually affect the game. It's all just flair. But then they have a system that is how you organize everything. It took me 2 hours to organize this.
That's a chonker.
But
it's got a lot going on.
Now it's all, like, generally pretty easy. Like, these are all of the pieces one player needs. And I can just hand this to a player and they're done. They're set up. They can do the rest of the setup by themselves, but that's all of their pieces. And it does get organized pretty well. The setup, I would say, is generally pretty easy, especially once you've played it a couple times. It still takes a little bit just because there are a lot of little pieces. But all things considered, for how big of a game it is, setup is pretty smooth. Takedown, not as smooth.
That's the kicker. You know. Sometimes
they always get you a takedown.
Deal with it. The game that I wanted to mention that I've been playing is Rolling Heights, which is not like a brand new game, but it is cool. It's a John D. Clair joint that doesn't use a card sleeving mechanism like a lot of his most popular and innovative stuff, or I guess the stuff he's most well known for. But it's kind of like a mix between Suburbia and Pass the Pig. Have you played Rolling Heights at all?
I've not played Rolling Heights. I have played Pass the Pig. Which is very fun.
Yeah, you're rolling meeples in a little chamber, and the different meeples have different things that they give you. The basic ones give you resources.
I did the Board Game Geek giveaway quiz for this.
Okay,
it's coming back to me. It's coming back to me. Yes, I remember this now.
Yeah, so it's... I don't know that it's like a super innovative game. It combines two interesting concepts, city building and the classic game of Pass the Pigs. And it does it with the, I guess, board game mascot that is Meeples. Mm-hmm. It ticks a lot of, little things in my brain that like to see things go up. The meeples are doing things, contributing things, and I get to push my luck a little to have them actually do even better things based off of how they're standing or cocked or laying on their back. And it's just a real pleasant city builder, engine building game that you wouldn't anticipate really having that smooth of a transition in something that has rolling frickin' meeples and a chamber on it. So, that's pretty cool. And then also John D. Clair related. I haven't played these yet, but I did just get a bunch of all-play games in because they release like 1 billion games a year, and they're like, hey, reviewers, take a look at these games. But I'm legit excited about these ones, especially Ruins and Oddland. Looked particularly cool, and Ruins is another John D. Clair game that does have a sleeving mechanism, but it's like a card shedding game, so kind of like an offshoot of trick taking, but you're also sleeving translucent cards into an existing card to make them more powerful or modify them, so that way they can be part of playing better hands. So cool ideas. Looking forward to it. We'll probably cover that on the channel here soon. And that's kind of what's shaking around here.
Well, and we also covered something else on the channel recently that I just think is worth noting, which is Fate of the Fellowship, the Lord of the Rings, the Pandemic System game.
Yeah, what a title.
That's the full title, right? That's what it is.
I think the full title is The Lord of the Rings, Fate of the Fellowship, and then there's like subtitle, a Pandemic System game, or maybe that's just kind of off in the margins on the box. I've noticed that in the iterations of their Pandemic System games, which are not pandemic games, like this is not Pandemic Iberia or the Fall of Rome. This is the Wrath of the Lich King, the Clone Wars, and now this. They're very much like, hey, this is this game, a pandemic system game. Yeah, it was on the channel, and the review seems to be doing really well. The game is at the top of the hotness right now. It's
probably because of the review. Almost certainly.
Exactly.
Yeah, and we'll take full credit for that. But that, as well as our conversation last week, has brought us to the topic of games based on other intellectual properties. That's the theme for this week. The transition was not as smooth as it normally is. I'm so sorry for new listeners. But we typically have a very smooth transition, not juddery at all. And by bringing it up, the fact that it's not smooth and that it's juddery this time, it makes it less juddery, right?
Yeah, it's hanging a lamp on it, I think is the literary term, which many of these games are based off of literary properties.
That is true. Well, and I think to start off with, I just want to quickly talk about how we got to this topic, because first of all, I suggested thematic games, which is a very nebulous concept, which is one of the reasons I gave you that adjective today. And it is just like, we were going back and forth on what does this even mean for the Golden Geek Awards. And then that kind of spiraled into, Fate of the Fellowship, I feel like, is very thematic. And then we got on to other IP-based games. And I think we also mentioned it in the podcast last week that this is a thing that gets done all the time in other forms of media, where you are making something that is based off of an IP that already exists because it makes it easier to sell it to an audience. Like, there's already an audience that is wanting to buy content of this style. Like, so many Star Wars books have been written because the universe already exists. It's easy to write within that universe. Some of that is no longer canon. So sorry to those people who wrote all of those pages about... is Mara Jade still canon in Star Wars? Do you know that off the top of your head?
Come on. Star Wars is not, one of my, heartstrings. I like Star Wars, but I didn't go down the, offshoot novel route with Star Wars in the way that a lot of people have. You want to talk to me about some Trek, you want to talk to me about some Middle Earth, I got your back on that. I've read some Wikipedia articles about Warhammer 40K without ever playing Warhammer 40K proper outside of a couple skirmishes in high school. I played some while I worked at the shop, but
Star Wars, you haven't gone on to Wikipedia?
Listen, I can tell you who IG-88 is.
That's actually impressive. Good job.
I know Salacious Crumb, okay? I know characters that have been in core Star Wars movies, and I've gone down those rabbit holes. Beyond that, I don't know what's legacy, what's canon. It's all a mess at this point.
It is all a mess at this point.
Somehow, Palpatine returned. That's all I know.
Somehow he always is doing that. It's nonsense.
What a guy.
Even in the extended universe. So... I kind of wanted to talk about this just because there are so many games out there that are kind of trying to use other intellectual properties as a base. And I think that there is a unfortunate side effect that comes with that for a lot of these games, which is that they become these big, bloated Kickstarter campaigns that end up being, not very fun games, but just a ton of miniatures thrown in there. So there are a couple games that I've seen that are like that. I'm not going to name them necessarily. But there are a lot, especially recently, especially as we've gone into I think a lot more board games have done that with Kickstarter, where there are these huge, massive campaigns for an IP that already exists. But then sometimes we get games that are kind of like that then are very well received. I know Slay the Spire has been very well received. Dead Cells has been very well received recently, and those are based on video games, so I think that there's maybe something to that, but there's so many games entering the zeitgeist based on other intellectual properties outside of board games, such as Fate of the Fellowship. It's a thing. The latest entry.
Such as Fate of the Fellowship. And what's cool is in that review, I was able to provide some historical context for some Lord of the Rings games, as well as Matt Leacock's relationship to cooperative games and impact on just board games as a whole. But licensed games go back way farther than that, including the original War for the Ring, which was an SPI game. Like, when we think of War of the Ring or War of the Ring 2nd Edition, that name is a reuse of an older war game, which I actually have on the shelf over there. I should have brought over for a nice visual.
Oh, yeah.
Like, the old War of the Ring SPI game is ancient by modern standards. I want to say it came out in the 70s, and it's like something that the Lord of the Rings was a massively popular book series, but it was still a book series. It wasn't a movie series at that point. Sure, yes, there's all this stuff about the Beatles were possibly going to do a Lord of the Rings movie. There's cartoon adaptations, but board games have been looking at ways of using fiction as a backdrop, and not just as kind of cheap cash-ins like skins of Risk and Monopoly and that kind of stuff for ages. So before we start talking about like specifically some of our favorites, what I thought would be a good starting point for us is like what do you think is key to having a successful adaptation? Like, to you, what are the things that you look for?
I am really looking for a game that plays with some of the themes from the original source material in a way that lets you connect with them further. So, like, that felt like kind of surface level. So one that I'll say is, I think that Dune Imperium does a good job adapting the, like, political intrigue, and you're kind of battling for Arrakis, but you're also battling to just have more power and influence over the world that you are on. I think that does a great job for me. So when I think of a good adaptation, that's one that I think of.
Yeah, so something that I'm always looking for, one of the things in Fate of the Fellowship that I was worried about is that it would be a lazy adaptation. Yeah. Like when something feels like a cash-in that doesn't understand, I guess, the thematic point of its material. Like, bringing it back to the Lord of the Rings, with the Reiner Knizia Lord of the Rings game, one thing that's easy to give it flack for is the fact that the Lord of the Rings, famously, you have your 4 hobbits who are going on this journey. You have Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin. And within the books, there is another part of their band, Fatty Bolger, who's another friend, a part of their gang. And he has a role to play in Shire, but he stays in Shire, essentially acting as Frodo. Spoilers for, a 70-year-old book. And, but he's just kind of like an afterthought, and it's also fun to make fun of his name. He's fatty. Yeah. He's a little chunko. His friends tease him, but that's all in good Hobbit jest. And Fredegar Bulger does not really take place in the journey, but they needed a fifth player in the Reiner Knizia game, and so you can play as Fatty, which is a little immersion breaking when you think about it. It's like Fatty Bulger was not, like hanging out in Lothlorien. This is not working for me.
Wait, what? He wasn't? He wasn't there?
But here's the thing. Here's what I'll say about that game. And I thought a lot about theme because we initially had the concept of just like theme. And I think that we're going to do a part 2 to this conversation because we're starting with intellectual property. And next week, I would like to talk about like how theme is displayed in games. Just a broader conversation. We don't have to have, a top list or anything, but like ways that games convey theme. And while there is the narrative breaking essence of having Fatty Bulger be a fifth hobbit that you can play as, the game actually understands that none of the events are literally true to the books. Like the fact that you could have Strider as part of the Fellowship going to Mordor, that's just as wrong to the narrative as having Fatty there. So if that's going to be the case, okay, some concessions could be made because we need a fifth player. What I find so beautiful about that game is that it understands that inherently the Lord of the Rings, even though it's an adventuresome story and there's a lot of fighting happening, I don't think part of the messaging by Tolkien was that war is won by like winning great battles, like true war against evil, like a society struggling to survive and persist and have identity and understanding what it costs to participate in battle. And that game, it has a lot of the kind of like hippy dippy crap that a lot of people don't like about the Lord of the Rings, like it's a lot of fellowship running away. It's a lot of pacifism is used to conquer certain elements, fight the despair, and to be able to endure the pain of bringing the ring to Mordor. And for being a game that came out in the late 90s, in the nascence of modern tabletop gaming, I think it does some really brilliant things to evoke the overall tone and essence of the Lord of the Rings, whether that was by design or by accident. That a lot of Lord of the Rings games where it's like, yo, you could be Gimli and chop off a bunch of orc heads, kind of misses the fundamental point of the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, and I think that kind of goes hand in hand with just the goal of the game. It's tough to say that the goal of the game should be anything other than we want a fun game. Because we do want a fun game. First and foremost,
absolutely,
the game should be fun. Second of all, the game should treat the source material with respect, in the way of like, I think that having Fatty Bulger may be an odd choice, but if it is like, this is the core trait of what makes Lord of the Rings, then I think all the play, and especially if it's a fun game, at that point, all the players are going to be pretty happy.
Yeah, and also, like there's a way of being respectful, but also being playful in the right way, laughing alongside something instead of laughing at, it's nice to have little memes and hilarious things here and there. Of course, Middle-earth is one of my settings, right? And so, like there are things that I make fun about it all the time. And I would say games like Fate of the Fellowship, as well as the Lord of the Rings trick-taking game, do a very good job at having Easter eggs that are the kind of sillier things that the fandom itself embraces, makes fun of, acknowledges. So you can have a little irreverence while still being reverent in a way. But you know, like I don't want to just saddle myself entirely in the world of Lord of the Rings or even Dune, because I think that's you know, like Dune is like the sci-fi equivalent of the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. That's
one intellectual property that I think is worth just kind of like diving into is Lovecraft. You know, like
there's so much.
The shared universe of Lovecraft. Much. And of course that's because it's in the public domain, right?
Yeah, totally.
So, you know, like and of course you have other things like Frankenstein or Frankenstein's monster. You have Dracula and kind of Eastern European vampire mythos, but those aren't nearly as popular in tabletop gaming as Lovecraft. Just Cthulhu, the Shoggoths, just
who doesn't love a good Shoggoth?
Exactly.
Who doesn't love a good Shoggoth?
Innsmouth fishy people abound. For whatever reason, this has really been part of the core identity of tabletop gaming for so long. And I think there's probably like a cool documentary to be made on the history and like obsession that tabletop gaming has with Lovecraft.
There's just so much. And I think that part of it comes with, first of all, it's in public domain. So it's you can adapt it pretty freely, which I think does incentivize people to adapt it.
Right.
Second of all, it is just such a well-documented lore. It's a really interesting lore of, like, here are all the monsters, here are the things that need to happen for these monsters to really ruin some days, or all of the days.
Right. And it gives automatic stakes, Cosmic horror gives like world-ending stakes, but the characters, the human characters, generally tend to be regular people, right? Yeah. And I think the other appealing thing about it is that you don't have to have the same level of reverence, mainly because of the kind of like terrible reputation by modern standards of Lovecraft himself. Like he's an incredibly problematic individual, and not even from a like, he's of his time. Like even at his time,
even in his time,
he was pretty wild in some of his opinions.
And
that said, he is one of the foundational pillars of American contribution to literature, in how the horror genre developed in America based off of a lot of his work. And so I think because of that, it gives permission to kind of dissect the lore and do with it what you will, as opposed to, say, Middle-earth, which I think if Middle-earth were in the public domain, there would still be deep nerds like myself who are like, but Papa Tolkien had it this way, and we need to treat it this way. And yes, there are plenty of reasons why Tolkien is a product of his time, and you could get into he's not a perfect individual, but I will die on the hill that he was a far cry from H.P. Lovecraft as far as
do we know what he
literary heroes.
Do we know what Tolkien named his cat? We should look this up.
No, but we do know how he told off the Nazis when they asked him if he had any Jewish heritage, so that way they could publish a translation of The Hobbit in German. And he was essentially like, F you, how dare you ask that? And I am sorry to say that I do not have the noble heritage of the Jewish people, but you are the most awful, and I hate you, and do not publish my book. We have that. Okay. We have that.
It doesn't seem like he had a cat from my very, very quick DuckDuckGo search.
He does have a granddaughter who is a blind fencing duelist.
Ooh, that's
kind of cool. Like, we can go in tangents, right?
We could go on tangents. We definitely have the time to do that.
Okay, so, like, now, one thing that, while we're on this public domain discussion and Lovecraft and kind of pivoting around, you as a game designer, someone who's looking for, ways to bring games to life, you're looking at themes. Have you considered using a public domain thing, an intellectual property? And if so, like, does that feel like it somehow cheapens or strengthens a product that you're working on?
I think that it...
And when are we getting your Steamboat Willie trick-taking game?
Dude, Steamboat Willie trick-taking game coming soon. I would say that, for me, at least, as a designer, I think that there can be a lot of fun to be had with having guardrails set in place of, like, this is the theme, this is how the world works. You don't have to make those choices. The burden of making choices of, like, how does this theme actually, like, play out is taken off of your shoulders, and that does free you to try to figure out ways to play within that. And that can be really fun and guiding you as a game designer to be like, this is where I am. This is what I have to play with. I can't go outside of this theme. This is where I'm at. I can't come up with a new character. I can't come up with like a new faction that would fix maybe some of the issues I'm having. At the same time, there are definitely things that come up with that where you aren't able to do that. I haven't really gotten too far into any of the things I'm doing to have it set on a theme. I mean, in theory, astro mining could pretty easily become like a Ray Bradbury short story, which he
that'd be
I
perfect.
Believe, no, there's no way. What am I
no,
he's
no too recent.
Yeah, he's too recent.
Come back in 50 years and we'll get your Martian Chronicles adaptation.
I would love to do a Martian Chronicles adaptation. I love that book so much. It's so
but you could probably do like some Edgar Allan Poe stuff,
Edgar Allan Poe. I could probably do the I'm forgetting the name of it. The movie where they shoot a thing into the moon and the moon is a face, and he gets shot into his eye.
Yeah.
Trip to the Moon by like the Lumiere brothers.
Right.
Something like that. Yeah. But you
could also do Night of the Living Dead, because that movie is in the public domain because like the copyright lapsed, which is why it is like everywhere and seen in countless other movies and stuff.
Oh, good for them.
Well,
probably bad
not
for
good
them. They're
for
not making
John
any money
Romero,
off
but
of it.
yeah.
Well, he's probably gotten. He's doing okay, I'm guessing.
But
probably. Yeah, I think that especially as a designer, having the rails put in place for you, it alleviates some things off your plate, but then it throws some other like just rules of what you're allowed to do and what you're allowed to change to make work. Because in theory, if you're starting your own design, you can say, whoa, well, I think that it would probably be really good if there was another faction that does this thing to help balance out the other 4 people we got going on. But if you're working with an IP, you can't just do that. You have to adapt it from within the world. And I think I haven't tried it. Maybe I should. I was thinking, I had a game that I was thinking from a IP that's not in public domain, which is why I haven't gone anywhere with it. But there's a book series that I'm really liking. It's coming out as we speak. So it's like the first 2 books are out. It's the God Killer series. And there's like a really interesting world that exists, and there's an interesting city that like people go into occasionally, and you're not supposed to go in there, and people go in there to like give things to gods, and gods are like banned in this world, and they're like wild gods. And I had like a really interesting game, or I think it's interesting, of like hidden movement as you try to go in to give gifts to gods. But I haven't. That is about as far as my thinking had gone on the topic, but maybe I'll revisit it. There's another book that I read recently that I owned it for a but was like, oh, I'll read it at some point because I like the author. But But then
Mistborn.
No. Well, yes, I did also read that recently. But the one that I'm thinking of, I saw at Platypus Con had been adapted into a board game, which is what made me go, that got adapted into a board game? Because it is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell.
Right.
A board game of English magic is what the adaptation was. But that made me go back and read the book because I was like, wait, this has a board game based on it? I thought this was just some random book I picked up because I like the author.
I think any of those, like, I mentioned deep nerd earlier, like any of these things that are really beloved within the nerd counterculture space, especially dating back to like before the explosion of comic book movies, a lot of those types of properties saw a lot of media usage in board games. Game of Thrones Second Edition is one of my pillars of just adapting an existing IP into a game, and that predates the show.
Yeah.
Turns out, the finishing of the book series, which they never would have thought, because we're still waiting on it. Game of Thrones and Game of Thrones Second Edition, which is the edition that's currently out, really, to me, represents some of peak game design, understanding of the things that people like most about a game, designing it to be a really fun game, while also understanding why people come to the fictional property as well. So, like, you could have just had, all right, this is a war game. Great. And then you have the different premier houses of the Song of Ice and Fire world. That could have worked. The house is paramount. The Lord's paramount. And that could have worked. But going a step deeper, the two things that to me really distinguish the game from other war games, area control games, are that it has a system for giving titles to different players that are vied for from different means. It could be either through providing power, through having supplies, or having the most lordship over castles at any time. And those titles then become their own independent tiebreakers or mechanical usage that are additives to the other mechanics of the game. And so you may have times where you want the Iron Throne just so that way you have the non-combative tiebreakers. Sometimes you want to have the Raven so that way you have the ability to do some subterfuge. Sometimes you want to have the sword so that way you can have the military tiebreakers and that awesome activatable once per round +1 in combat. But all these things are fought over and woven together independent of the actual fighting that's happening on the board.
Yeah.
And that adds such a great layer to it. And that's only one of the two pillars that I think the game really understands the nuances and interconnectedness of Martin's work, which the other one is that it operates off of orders that you place in advance, and then you reveal and then activate them once you can see what's on the board.
Yeah. And
that allows you to have a huge amount of negotiation and bluffing. Of course, it's influenced by diplomacy as a game design. However, there's more mechanical layers, and it provides this sense that you are having to anticipate things while, relying on trust and mistrust that you've placed on others, and a fog of war. essentially, where while you're making your plans, you can't know for certain what everyone else's plans are. And then once things are in motion, you only have so much ability to pivot. You do have some ability to pivot, but you're limited in the ways in which you can react. And that is so true to the essence of the military conflicts in Song of Ice and Fire. And that gives it realism not only to the immersiveness of a cool war game, but it gives it such resonance to what some of the things that George Martin was trying to convey with the written work.
Yeah.
So that's like a masterful job at adapting this stuff.
Yeah, I would say there is just playing within the world of A Song of Ice and Fire just gives you so many cool levers to pull on, and it's really heartening to hear that they were able to pull on so many of the levers that the world provided them, like especially to play in. Yeah, because I haven't played that game. I just have never gotten to a player account where I could play it. But
it's a chonker. It's another chonker. Yeah.
Nice one. But yeah, I mean, I think that there's something to be said of with these games, like just making use of the intellectual property in a way that makes it feel rewarding, or identifiable is probably what I would say. So like one game that I love this game is Treasure Island.
Right.
I don't think it really made amazing use of the intellectual property. Like, it clearly is. It's your pirates. You're playing as pirates.
Right.
And there's, like, you're searching for treasure. But, like, it could be any pirate. Any of these pirates. Like, it does not, from what I have seen, does not really play into the world of Treasure Island. Like, it just uses the character names. I don't really know how John Hawthorne, I don't know what within the book makes him use the outer ring of his circle versus the inner ring of his circle. But he does, I guess.
Right.
And I think that it's a good game. So again, going based off of principle number 1, make a fun game. But the principle number 2 of like making use of the intellectual property in a way that makes it feel distinctly, you could not retheme this game to another intellectual property and keep it the same.
Right. So I think some things to be aware of when you're thinking about intellectual property as like a board game consumer is that it's a very different business, of course, because most of the time you're having to license the intellectual property. And it also means that you have a degree of checks. If you're making the game, you have to have all kinds of checks and insurances that you're going to handle the game appropriately. Speaking of John D. Clare earlier, I mentioned Mistborn earlier. He designed the Mistborn game for Brotherwise Games, and Brandon Sanderson had to play the game to vet it. Now, Brandon Sanderson is famously also a Magic the Gathering player.
Yeah.
He knows his stuff when it comes to games. Yeah. But, like, he needed to play it and actually make sure that it was a game that he liked, as well as doing all this stuff with Dragonsteel to ensure that it was appropriately handled and that you weren't misrepresenting something, that you weren't spoiling something in a way that you didn't want the audience to know. That creates additional constraints that happen when it comes to these games. And then there's even like weird movie tie-in stuff, like with Dune Imperium when that came out.
Timothy,
there were images. I remember in the Dune subreddit where people were scouring the artist renderings of Dune Imperium that had been released because the movie had been delayed enough and we had barely seen anything in the movie. So, like, even trailers hadn't shown us what Peter DeVries looked like. And so people were like, oh, we get our first look at Peter DeVries from Dune Imperium. all kinds of weird stuff happens when you have these licensed tie-ins. Point being, there are a lot more hands in the pie when it comes to these things. What's going on here?
It did the thumbs up again. It always gets me.
Oh, nice.
It's really not that funny.
It always gets
it really is not that funny. Whenever Jack does a thumbs up, it just pops up with like a little bubble, thumbs up.
Nice.
I'm happy you touched on it. Our comment from our post asking about everybody's favorite IP-based board games or like any hot takes they had was from D Larson27 saying their favorite game and therefore their favorite IP game is Dune 2019. Does a great job of pulling you into the setting. There are multiple good games in the Dune universe, but they are far more set in Middle-earth. And they ask, what makes Lord of the Rings such fertile ground for board games? Is it simply that so many people are so familiar with the stories via the books and movies and are inspired by them to design board games? It does seem like the game rights have been spread around to many publishers, which helps a lot, as opposed to something like Star Wars, which they believe is exclusively held by Fantasy Flight Games for board games, and their Star Wars output seems to be fairly slow these days outside of the CCG. I believe we can take at face value that it is such a like intro to nerddom like world. So between the movies and the books and all of the other content that has already come beforehand, it is a very gateway setting into being like a hardcore nerd. On top of that, because Asmodee and Middle-earth are one and the same for most intents and purposes, they can easily get these games like the copyright approved, like they don't need to like license it, like they own it, which I think does make it a setting that people can play in a lot more, at least recently.
So I think that's part of it. I think that conflict and collaboration are at the heart of gameplay, right? And I think that there are much easier analogs to pull on in the Lord of the Rings and Middle-earth in general when it comes to conflict and collaboration. Both of those aspects, even in a competitive game, collaboration and conflict, those are, like one way that games oscillate between one another. Like even sitting down to play a game is inherently collaborative. Even if we're competing against one another, that game doesn't exist until, a suitable number of players, barring solo games, is sitting down to play. And it's a much cleaner, easier pill to swallow when it comes to Lord of the Rings, as opposed to, say, something like Dune, which is much more morally gray, much more subjective. I think they're both incredibly rich, and both worthwhile from a literary perspective. And I love both, absolutely, and have read like all the material that Frank Herbert put into Dune. I've read all the material that Tolkien put into Middle-earth. But I think Middle-earth is like Star Wars in that it is easier to have these analogs. It's easier to have good versus bad. It's easier to have these kind of like iconic characters. So familiarity definitely goes into it. And then I think that as far as things like Star Wars, for example, Star Wars has become so specific that there are people who would probably not play a Star Wars game because they're like, I don't like Star Wars. If I don't like Star Wars, I don't want to play a Star Wars game. Whereas I think with Middle-earth, it is so easy to just kind of call it generic fantasy at this point because everything has built upon that it's very easy to just kind of dismiss the Middle-earthiness about things. If you're just like, man, I hate Tolkien's work, I like much more grimdark, nuanced anti-hero fantasy, that's totally fine. You probably can still enjoy the game and just kind of like dismiss that whole heart of it. Harder to do with a lot of other properties.
And I think there's so many different... Middle-earth just gives you so many different lenses to view it from, where you can have it be like this very white out, one person versus one person duel for Middle-earth, where one person is taking on as Sauron, one person is the Fellowship. You also could do, we're going to all play together, we're going to do chapter by chapter Lord of the Rings trick-taking game. Or Fate of the Fellowship. You know? Like there's, darkness is spreading. The battle is against darkness. There's like so many different avenues to approach it because there is so much. And again, this kind of goes back to it is very easy to like black and white. This is good. This is evil. This is one person is playing this. One person's playing that. Done. This is great.
Yeah. Even conflict, like, if you're having war happen in Middle-earth, it's one of the weaknesses of Tolkien's work is that you kind of just have generic bad guys. There is some degree of nuance. I could get into refuting some of it, but that is an acknowledged weakness of the work, is that the war is never that easy, and people aren't monocultures. However, Frank Herbert was very interested in war not being that easy, and there not being monocultures. And when there are monocultures, that can be a problem and taken advantage of. And so when you have war and conflict in, say, Dune, the more it taps into the themes of the source material, the more you're calling into question the, like, I guess, unease that you might have with some of the things that are happening. It's easier to start questioning, like, is it this clean? Is it this easy? Was Paul a hero? What are charismatic leaders? Am I like a Machiavellian evildoer who's just manipulating these people? Am I confined to my fate because of my prescient vision? Like, there's all kinds of things in there that question the whole premise of what is often fun about a game, which is I just want to throw down and kill some dudes.
Yeah, totally. And who doesn't want to just throw down and kill some dudes? We're all here for that. We're all here to just throw down, take some dudes out back and kill them.
That's what Blood Rage is for.
Yeah.
But I think next week we will talk about much more just like how does a game reflect theme,
and how does it express it?
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way of putting it. Like what makes a game thematic and what are some of the levers that a game designer might pull? What are the things that we look for and the things that resonate with us when we're playing a game? Yeah. Because a lot of times as a reviewer, you'll play a game and you'll go like, this feels really thematic. But what does that mean? It has a lot of art. It feels thematic. We'll dissect that a little bit more next week.
Absolutely. If you have any questions that are related to that, please feel free to comment them on YouTube or on Spotify, or email them into us at cardboardherald@gmail.com. Thank you to DLarson27 for commenting. We appreciate you, and we appreciate that you picked Dune. We both love Dune, so glad that was represented here by somebody. And thank you so much for tuning in. Thanks for listening. If you have any topics you want us to take a gander at, or just anything you want to let us know, feel free to reach us through the avenues mentioned previously. Thanks for tuning in. I have been Eric with the Cardboard Herald, joined most of the time by Jack.
Peace.